What the most dangerous moment in a championship final didn't begin in the air, but in a storage tent the night before. The defending world champion had landed that trick hundreds of times. It wasn't experimental. It wasn't risky by his standards. It was routine. The heel edge set up into a high rotation spin that had closed out 3 consecutive finals. On the night of the championship, the half-pipe conditions were ideal. The snow was compact. The edges were clean. Wind negligible. Commentators described it as a perfect stage for dominance. His first 2 hits confirmed it. Clean amplitude, controlled grabs, stable landings. Then came the third wall. At approximately 40 miles per hour, he shifted weight onto his heel edge, the critical moment before takeoff. That edge is everything in snowboarding. It determines angle, trajectory, rotational timing. Replay footage later showed something subtle. A micro delay. The board did not grip immediately. His center of mass drifted slightly outside optimal alignment. The rotation initiated half a beat late. He came down off-axis and crashed. Hard enough to end the run. Hard enough to eliminate him from title contention. At first glance, it looked like competitive error, the kind even elite athletes make under pressure. The broadcast commentary leaned in that direction immediately. He just lost the edge. Maybe nerves. But at the bottom of the pipe, the athlete did not react like someone who made a mistake. He stared at his board, not at the scoreboard, not at the judges, not at the crowd, at the board. His breathing wasn't frantic. It was analytical, controlled, almost clinical. He ran his glove along the heel edge once. Then again, slower. His technician rushed over, expecting frustration. Instead, he got a question. "Did you touch this after inspection?" The technician shook his head immediately. No, there was no accusation in the air yet, just confusion. The board was carried off the competition floor and into the restricted equipment tent for routine post-crash evaluation. Officials followed, not urgently, but curiously. Under brighter light, the first anomaly appeared. The rear binding screw was not flush, not visibly loose, not wobbling, but slightly backed out. Enough that, under high rotational torque, it could create micro-shift. Micro-shift at 40 miles per hour is not cosmetic. It's destabilizing. The technician grabbed a torque driver and tested it. The reading came back below spec. 20% under the logged setting from earlier that afternoon. That detail didn't explode the room. It chilled it. Because torque doesn't change without cause. Metal contracts in cold. Yes. But contraction tightens screws. It doesn't loosen them in uniform reverse rotation. Impact can shift hardware. But the crash occurred after the instability. Which means if torque changed, it changed before the fall. Now the first version of the story begins to fracture. Version 1, he choked. Elite athletes sometimes do. Under lights, under expectation, under the weight of defending a title. Version 2, the equipment didn't respond the way it should have. Investigators weren't ready to choose, so they examined the edge. Snowboard edges are precision tools. Machine-tuned edges leave symmetrical. Consistent micro-grooves visible under magnification. Even hand polishing follows predictable patterns. This heel edge did not. Under light, faint directional abrasions appeared along a 4-inch section, precisely the section that would engage during a heel-side launch. The marks were subtle, controlled, localized, not catastrophic enough to trigger immediate detection during inspection, but enough to reduce bite at high load angles. That's where tension climbs another rung. Because random where is random? This wasn't random. The board had cleared inspection hours earlier. It had been placed in a restricted rack inside a credential-controlled tent. Access required badge authentication, which means either A, the irregularities were introduced after inspection, or B, the inspection missed them entirely. If inspection missed both torque deviation and edge irregularity, that's systemic failure. If they were introduced after inspection, that's interference. Both scenarios are troubling, but only one implies intent. Officials pulled the maintenance log. Rear binding torque had been verified at 4:12 p.m. Edge polish recorded. No binding adjustment requested afterward, which narrows the timeline. The board was stable at 4:12 p.m. It was compromised before the 8:30 p.m. finals. That's a 6-hour window. Inside a restricted environment. Could vibration during transport loosen that exact screw by that exact percentage? Testing would later suggest unlikely. Could a minor accidental bump in the tent alter edge integrity so precisely? Possible, but improbable. And improbability in investigations is fuel. Still, suspicion is not proof. Athletes sometimes search for explanations after defeat. Technicians sometimes overanalyze hardware. Pressure distorts perception. Officials had to consider the psychological variable. Did the champion feel something wrong because he fell? Or did he fall because something was wrong? That distinction is the heart of this crisis. Replay footage was analyzed frame by frame. At the moment of takeoff, the board hesitated. The heel edge did not engage cleanly. The rear foot alignment drifted half a degree. Half a degree at full velocity changes everything. The crash was not violent enough to suggest catastrophic failure. It was subtle instability caused by subtle compromise. If this were sabotage, it was calibrated, not to injure, not to destroy equipment, just enough to disrupt precision. And that's what makes it unsettling, because catastrophic sabotage exposes itself. Subtle sabotage hides inside doubt. Officials now face two equally dangerous outcomes. Declare it mechanical error and risk ignoring interference. Declare it sabotage and accuse someone without direct evidence. The only way forward was to reconstruct access. Who touched that board between inspection and finals? Because access is binary. Either no one did, or someone did. And if someone did, the badge logs would show it. When investigators pulled entry records from the restricted tent, one 12-minute window stood out. And inside that window, only one credential had proximity to rack B12. The crisis was no longer the fall. The crisis was narrowing. And once narrowing begins, it rarely widens again. If the board was altered even slightly, the next question is unavoidable. Who had the ability to do it? Without raising immediate suspicion, elite winter competitions operate under layered security. Equipment tents are not casual storage spaces. They are controlled environments governed by accreditation systems, digital badge scans, and limited entry permissions. Every athlete's board is tagged after inspection. Every movement in and out of the tent is theoretically traceable. The word theoretically would become important. Officials began with badge logs from the 12-hour window before finals. Between 6 p.m. and midnight, 14 entries were recorded. Most were routine. Athletes collecting gloves, technicians re-waxing boards, officials conducting climate checks. At 9:47 p.m., the champion's board tag registered as removed from rack position B12. At 9:59 p.m., it was returned. 12 minutes. The badge that unlocked the rack belonged to a certified technician named Daniel Kessler, contracted not to the champion, but to another finalist. Kessler was experienced. 12 seasons on the circuit. No disciplinary record. Known for meticulous tuning and aggressive edge preparation. When questioned, he did not deny entering the tent. He confirmed adjusting his own athlete's board. He initially denied touching the champion's equipment, but when presented with rack movement logs, his answer shifted slightly. I may have moved it to access another board. I don't recall adjusting anything. That change, subtle but measurable, introduced friction. Because in controlled environments, memory gaps matter. The tent's interior cameras, however, presented a complication. Due to privacy and competitive confidentiality concerns, cameras monitored entrances and exits, not individual racks. There was no direct visual confirmation of what happened inside, so investigators turned to proximity analysis. Kessler's assigned rider was stored 2 racks down from the champion. In tight quarters, incidental contact is plausible. Equipment tents are crowded before finals. Boards lean. Bags overlap. Movement is constrained. But incidental contact does not explain. A binding screw under-torqued by 22%. Manual abrasion marks inconsistent with machine tuning. The absence of documentation for any authorized adjustment. The champion's technician provided maintenance logs. The last recorded adjustment had been made at 4:12 p.m., edge polish only. Binding torque had been verified at standard spec, which meant if the torque had changed, it happened after 4:12 p.m. and before 10 p.m. That narrows the window to under 6 hours. The number of people physically capable of making that adjustment was small, fewer than 10 individuals with credentials that evening. Investigators interviewed each one. Most entries were brief, under 5 minutes. Quick retrievals. No rack disturbance recorded near B12. Only one entry overlapped the 12-minute window where the board was removed. Daniel Kessler. When asked directly why the board tag registered as removed, Kessler explained that boards are sometimes shifted to prevent edge collision in tight storage. That tent gets chaotic before finals. True, multiple athletes confirmed congestion, but none recalled seeing the champion's board relocated. Meanwhile, the rival athlete, Kessler's contracted rider, was asked whether he had requested any last-minute changes to his own equipment. He confirmed a minor edge sharpening request at 9:30 p.m. Investigators cross-referenced tool usage logs. The filing tool signed out at 9:41 p.m. was returned at 9:58 p.m. The timing aligned precisely with the 12-minute rack movement window. Still, alignment is not admission, and investigative integrity required caution. Mechanical irregularities could, in theory, result from overzealous tuning intended for another board. A mix-up, a rushed moment, a careless adjustment. Negligence and sabotage can look similar at the micro level, but the stakes change everything. Because if this were negligence, it was extraordinary, and if it were deliberate, it was dangerous. Under competition safety codes, intentional equipment compromise could qualify as criminal interference, especially if it knowingly increased injury risk, which reframes the situation entirely. This was no longer about competitive advantage. It was about whether someone had crossed from gamesmanship into endangerment. And that line is thin, but legally decisive. Investigators requested torque replication tests. If accidental contact or tool slip could realistically produce the exact mechanical profile observed, then the sabotage theory weakens. If not, restriction would turn into implication. Because when you limit who had access, and you limit when it could have occurred, the circle narrows. And in this case, it was narrowing around one name. But narrowing isn't proof. And before intent can be considered, there has to be mechanical certainty, which means the next stage isn't about access. It's about physics. And physics doesn't respond to loyalty. It responds to force. Why would anyone risk crossing the invisible line between competitive gamesmanship and outright sabotage? In elite sport, medals are measured in milliseconds, but the stakes extend far beyond victory. Reputation, sponsorships, national pride, and financial incentive often outweigh the rules themselves. At the center of this unfolding investigation, a question burned brighter than the stadium lights. Who would benefit if the champion fell? Officials and investigators turned to motive analysis. On the surface, Daniel Kessler, the technician identified in the restricted tent window, had no documented grievances. He was professional, seasoned, and respected. His own athlete, the one he had been contracted to, had a legitimate interest in performing well. But Kessler was also a technician who thrived under pressure, meticulous, calculating, and intensely competitive in his professional identity. Financial stakes were subtle but real. The rival athlete sponsor had promised a substantial bonus contingent on podium placement, a fraction of which could indirectly benefit Kessler's employment prospects. In a world where equipment technicians' reputations rise and fall with their athletes' medals, even minor influence on outcomes can translate into career longevity, promotions, and elite contracts. It is a quiet, indirect reward structure, enough to seed opportunity without overt instruction. beyond personal gain, there was national and team pressure. Rival teams had incentives to see the defending champion fall. Even subtle manipulation of results could reshape the medal tally, rewrite national standings, and secure lucrative sponsorship deals for underdog teams. In winter sports, where prize pools are modest compared to global attention, national prestige often outweighs monetary reward. A single goal can shift funding, attract media attention, and consolidate authority for coaching staff and sports federations. But psychological profiles matter as much as incentives. Investigators considered the possibility of pride, rivalry, and the human tendency to assert control over uncertain outcomes. In elite competition, minor adjustments, real or imagined, can feel like necessary interventions. Was it negligence justified as precision, or a deliberate act designed to unbalance a superior competitor at the precise moment? The line is thin, and in the absence of confession, motive is inferred from pattern and consequence. Witness testimony added tension. Fellow technicians reported seeing Kessler unusually focused on the champion's board during equipment checks. Some described it as overly attentive, while others rationalized it as care for the overall fairness of the tent environment. Two contrasting narratives emerged, one suggesting deliberate interference, the other routine diligence. Investigators also looked at timing. The 12-minute window in the restricted tent coincided almost perfectly with the minor adjustments and abrasions discovered on the board. Could this have been an innocent overlap, a technician navigating crowded racks? Possibly, but the precision required to produce the exact mechanical anomalies observed, backed out torque, localized edge filing, is not trivial. It suggests an understanding of how the board would respond under competitive load, a knowledge usually reserved for the athlete or someone intimately familiar with the setup. And then there were past incidents. While nothing criminal had been recorded, internal memos revealed that Kessler's team had previously been accused of aggressive edge adjustments to optimize rival performance. No penalties had been imposed, and the adjustments were framed as legal tuning strategies. But in retrospect, these episodes painted a pattern. Fine line between optimization and manipulation, competence and interference. Here, history intersected with probability. A mechanical engineer specializing in sports equipment was consulted. He confirmed that the anomalies could have altered performance sufficiently to cause the crash. He also stated that such precise micro-abrasion is difficult to achieve accidentally, particularly in a crowded, high-pressure environment. Yet, he stopped short of labeling it intentional. It's subtle enough to be either, he said, leaving room for doubt. This withheld judgment heightened suspense. The viewer cannot anchor certainty. By the end of the intent investigation, the audience faces an unsettling truth. If sabotage occurred, it was calculated, methodical, and nearly invisible. If it didn't, it was a convergence of minor mechanical variance, human error, and extraordinarily bad timing. Either way, the fall was no accident to fate. It was the product of extreme precision, whether by accident or design. And just as the tension peaks, investigators pivot to the next question, the next layer, the method. How exactly could a technician execute such subtle interference without detection? How do physics, timing, and human error intersect to produce a controlled fall? The answer doesn't lie in intent alone. It lies in the mechanics. If intent alone could decide the story, the narrative would end in speculation. But sport is physics. Precision matters. Gravity matters. Friction matters. And in this championship, the method of interference or the accidental convergence was measurable, repeatable, and terrifyingly subtle. Investigators began by reconstructing the exact environmental conditions in which the champion's board had been stored, transported, and ultimately launched down the halfpipe. Snow temperature, air humidity, and board material properties were all meticulously logged. Every variable that could affect binding torque, edge engagement, or micro-shift in steel composition was accounted for. The goal was simple: replicate the fall using controlled experiments without endangering the athlete. The first test focused on torque. Technicians removed a spare board identical to the champion's, securing all bindings to specification. They then intentionally under-tightened the rear binding by 22%, matching the post-crash measurement. The board was mounted on a mechanical rig, simulating the precise heel-edge takeoff of the final wall. At 40 miles per hour, the simulation revealed the exact micro-delay in rotation the champion had experienced. A split-second misalignment, only observable through high-speed camera analysis, was enough to destabilize the landing. Next, the heel-edge abrasions were recreated. Using subtle hand-filing techniques and machine guidance, investigators replicated the localized marks found on the board. The marks altered the friction coefficient by a fraction of a percent, enough that, under the extreme lateral force of takeoff, the edge slid slightly, failing to bite the snow at the critical moment. In repeat trials, boards without the abrasion held perfectly. Boards with the simulated marks replicated the crash pattern with uncanny precision. The method, if intentional, was surgical. Investigators then reconstructed the access window. Using timed entries, they had volunteers, credentialed technicians, navigate the crowded tent scenario, moving boards in tight racks as possible, but reproducing the precise micro-abrasion in under 12 minutes, while leaving no visible evidence, proved exceptionally difficult. Only someone with intimate knowledge of board mechanics, tool handling, and competitive physics could have achieved it. To simulate alternate explanations, investigators tested accidental scenarios. Could a rushed edge check on an adjacent board have inadvertently scratched the champion's board? Could incidental contact loosen a binding screw? The results were inconclusive. Accidental interventions produced variations in torque and edge friction, but not in the precise alignment and location observed on the rail board. Random contact could create chaos, but it could not replicate subtle destabilization consistently. Forensic physics now intersected with psychology. If someone wanted to crash, they didn't need to damage the entire board. Too obvious, too risky. One binding slightly loose, one heel edge imperfection, and gravity takes care of the rest. The subtlety required not only knowledge of mechanics, but a deep understanding of the athlete's technique, how they shift weight when they load the heel, and exactly where micro-friction affect trajectory. The method was invisible to the untrained eye, but catastrophic when measured in millimeters and milliseconds. Investigators also explored environmental manipulation. Ice temperature, humidity, and wax application can all change board performance. But on finals day, sensors recorded conditions identical across competitors. No anomalies existed outside the board itself. This eliminated external sabotage, reinforcing that if foul play occurred, the method was internal, precise, and nearly imperceptible. At this point, all variables aligned: access, motive, intent, and method. The crash could be perfectly reproduced with a board under-torqued by 22% and bearing localized heel edge abrasion. A random fall could not replicate the exact mechanical anomalies observed. The method, therefore, existed and could be executed, whether by accident or deliberate interference, but with high probability leaning toward precision intervention. And yet, the investigators did not publicly accuse anyone. The evidence remained suggestive, not conclusive. The method exposed capability, not admission. It also raised the final question. If someone could engineer a crash this subtle, what other margins in elite sport are vulnerable to invisible manipulation? The moment the crash replay circulated, the world began to speculate. Social media erupted. Commentators debated. Fans dissected every frame. The champion, once invincible in the eyes of his supporters, was suddenly vulnerable. But the fallout extended beyond headlines. Careers, reputations, and the integrity of an entire competition were now under scrutiny. The athlete himself was devastated. He had trained his entire life for perfection. And yet, in one calculated misalignment, the championship slipped away. Post-run interviews were measured almost eerily calm, but his eyes betrayed the truth. Disbelief, frustration, and a gnawing question. Was this a mere accident? Or had someone intentionally compromised his equipment? Regulatory bodies launched inquiries immediately. The International Snowboarding Federation, ISF, convened a panel of experts, equipment specialists, former athletes, and forensic engineers. They reviewed logs, torque readings, video analysis, and tent access records. The 12-minute window was scrutinized endlessly, but the panel stopped short of declaring sabotage. Evidence suggests interference is possible, one statement read, but proof beyond reasonable doubt is not yet established. The media, of course, had no such restraint. Headlines screamed accusations. Sabotage at the snowboarding finals? Who touched the champion's board? Inside the mystery of the heel edge crash. Pundits analyzed prior incidents involving technicians, noting Kessler's past edge adjustments and the unusually crowded tent environment. Conspiracy theories flourished. Sponsors reacted quietly at first. The champion's primary sponsor issued a neutral statement. Support for the athlete, confidence in investigative processes, and reaffirmation of fair competition standards. The rival athlete sponsor, under scrutiny due to indirect potential benefit, similarly offered guarded comments. Internally, funding committees began recalculating bonuses and insurance clauses. In elite sport, even the suggestion of interference can ripple into contractual negotiations and financial risk management. Within the team, trust fractured. Technicians reviewed every protocol. Conversations that had been routine became interrogations. Every movement in and out of equipment storage was now documented in minute detail. Relationships that had lasted seasons were strained. Who could be trusted? Who had opportunity? The emotional fallout mirrored the mechanical one, precise, invisible, and quietly destructive. The athlete eventually returned to training, but caution replaced instinct. Every turn on the slope carried lingering doubt. Repetition drills became obsessive inspections. Subtle micro-adjustments were now scrutinized under high-resolution video. Even minor errors in board setup invoked anxiety, a psychological consequence of the crash far more lasting than physical bruises. Fans and commentators continued debating online forums and news outlets, weighing the evidence presented. Was this an unfortunate chain of coincidences, or was the crash orchestrated with surgical precision? The ambiguity fueled engagement, and the legend of the incident grew. Videos of the fall became case studies, cited in sports ethics seminars and technical courses in equipment maintenance. The narrative had moved beyond a single competition. It became a cautionary tale about the invisible edges of elite sport. Eventually, the official inquiry closed without charges. Kessler, the technician, retained his contract but with heightened scrutiny. Equipment protocols were tightened across all teams. Badge access logs were digitized in real time. Micro-inspections of torque and edge became mandatory before finals. What was once routine now carried a forensic layer, a permanent shadow cast by the championship incident. The champion's legacy remained intact in some respects, but the public perception shifted subtly. Fans revered his skill, but whispered about vulnerability. Every subsequent competition carried the invisible weight of that fall. For journalists, it became a story of moral ambiguity, the fine line between human error, professional risk, and intentional manipulation. For athletes, it became a psychological milestone. Perfection is never guaranteed, even when skill and preparation are flawless. The winter competition world would never look at equipment, access, or precision in quite the same way. And for those who witnessed the incident, in person on broadcast or through investigative reconstruction, the memory would linger, a chilling reminder that in elite sport, sometimes the real danger happens before the first jump, in the silent spaces behind the ice.